Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance (ESG). This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, I interview Bill Shevlin, CEO of Net Zero Beyond. Net Zero Beyond is a platform that develops, finances, owns, and operates carbon neutral and carbon negative microgrids and virtual power plants across the United States. The technologies Net Zero uses include energy storage, solar, wind, waste to energy, biodigesters, hydrogen, energy management software, fuel cells, electric vehicle chargers, hydrogen production, IoT devices, and more. Net Zero serves residential, commercial markets, as well as industrial, manufacturing, controlled environmental agriculture, and government markets. Hello, and welcome to ESG Talks. This is Emilie Nadler, a director on KBRA's ESG team. I'm happy to be joined today by Bill Shevlin from Net Zero Beyond. Bill, thanks so much for coming on. Bill, I'd just like to start off at a pretty broad level and ask you a basic question. So what is a microgrid?
Sure, that's a good question. We get asked that a lot. Essentially, a microgrid provides on-site power for buildings and structure, but also can provide on-site fueling for electricity, electric vehicles, and hydrogen vehicles as well.
Great. Thank you. I think that's really helpful just to frame the discussion. So how does the work that Net Zero does fit into the energy space?
I appreciate the question. So we provide on-site infrastructure that's specific to the site. Each site has its own requirements when it comes to infrastructure, and we work closely with the client to make sure that infrastructure matches their needs.
Well, I think that this is a very timely discussion as Russia's war in Ukraine has really put a spotlight on energy security as global sanctions have led to higher energy prices, especially in the EU. And then in the US, we've seen heat waves and extreme weather this summer that have really wreaked havoc on an already fragile infrastructure system. So, for example, in early September, California requested that people with electric vehicles not charge their cars until further notice. So does microgrid technology have the potential to kind of change the landscape of global energy access and stability?
Yeah, it does. And we have seen a speed of adoption due to all the circumstances you're mentioning. Everyone's seen energy and fuel prices spike in the last year. Additionally, due to climate impacts, we've seen hotter days in more areas, which stresses the grid and increases demand. The increased climate instability, it's coupled with aging infrastructure that's not designed to adapt to the increased loads from weather, plus the increased loads that EV charging and larger decarbonization efforts are going to require.
And so I think getting just a little bit more detailed, can you talk about the financing mechanism here and how do the projects that Net Zero works on typically get funded?
Sure. That's a good question. So we typically work with a site, might be an industrial park, might be a commercial building, and we essentially turn that building or that industrial site's consumption into net zero infrastructure upgrades. We essentially accomplish this by evaluating the consumption of energy and fuels, and then we convert this into an economic model that allows us to provide on-site power and fuel for EVs as well as hydrogen vehicles at a fixed cost that's equal or lower to what they were paying before. We essentially enter into a long-term agreement with the site or municipality to provide these costs and these services at a fixed price.
Great. And so I think we've covered microgrids really have the potential to transform energy systems and infrastructure. But what are some of the other spillover effects? Do microgrids have the potential to create positive effects for the surrounding communities, cities, and regions?
They do. And just to give you an example, we're working with a group that's developing truck stops. And so as we electrify and as we decarbonize and increase hydrogen vehicles and electric vehicles, there's a larger load at these sites. And in many cases, as we transition, these sites will actually use as much power as the community itself. And because of that, we could actually provide a resiliency hub into that community, which can provide always on clean power for the entire community over time.
Great. That's really incredible. And it's really exciting to hear about all of the positive benefits outside of increased energy supply that microgrids create. I think it might be helpful for our listeners to get a better understanding of the mechanics of microgrids and kind of the positive benefits of microgrid technology with a few examples. Are there some projects that Net Zero has been working on that you can describe in a bit more detail?
Sure. Yeah. One of our larger projects that we're working on is a large scale industrial park that has or will have solar, wind, energy storage, and waste to energy. We're providing basically an always on carbon negative power as well as hydrogen at that location. Additionally, we're installing a water treatment and waste treatment facility. Our microgrid will be providing EV charging infrastructure as well as the hydrogen fueling infrastructure. And a lot of the products that are manufactured or stored at that facility will have no carbon footprint related to the energy consumption as well as the fuel consumption of the site. The site's going to have always on carbon negative energy and fuels, and the site will be paying less for the utilities, less for their EV charging, their hydrogen fueling, and their costs are going to be fixed over the next 20 years.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that overview, Bill, and very fascinating to hear more details about that specific project. I want to thank you for coming on ESG Talks and telling our audience about the really positive ESG potential of microgrids. It's definitely a very interesting space to watch.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you to Bill for a very interesting discussion. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter. This concludes our episode. New episodes of ESG Talks air every other week. In the meantime, please visit kbra.com to access our other podcast series as well as our ratings and research.